Hello everyone, this is Mr. Lawback. In this video, we are going to go over the age of Jackson. So Jackson, of course, is Andrew Jackson. Throughout this video, he will be referred to as AJ, and this is part 1, and there will be a part 2. So in this video, we will go over Jackson's background, the election of 1824, which became known as the Corrupt Bargain, the election of 1828, key aspects of Jacksonian democracy, the Tariffs of Abomination, and the kitchen cabinet, and of course we will finish up by going over some big takeaways. So first, a little bit about Andrew Jackson's background. He was the 7th President of the United States, served 2 terms from 1829 to 1837. He was a Democrat. He was born in North Carolina, like right on the border of North Carolina and South Carolina. He was a controversial dude, and even where he was born was controversial. It's either in North or South Carolina. His parents were Irish immigrants. Andrew Jackson and his brothers joined the Revolutionary War on the side of the Patriots. He actually ended up being a Revolutionary prisoner of war, the only president ever to be a prisoner of war. Jackson was orphaned at the age of 14. He ended up being a self-taught frontier lawyer and moved to Tennessee and helped Tennessee gain its statehood in 1796, where he ended up becoming the first representative in Congress for the new state of Tennessee. And of course, Andrew Jackson was a military hero. He was a war hero, the Battle of New Orleans, and then also the Creek Wars. Jackson earned the nickname of Old Hickory because he seemed as tough as the hardest American hardwood trees, the hickory tree. To the election of 1824. The era of good feelings proved to be brief. The debate over slavery and the return of partisan political factions within the Democratic-Republican Party eroded the consensus on national goals that had been the hallmark of the Monroe presidency. In 1824, 4 regional candidates vied for the presidency. Jackson received most of the popular and electoral votes. However, John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, and Henry Clay also ran. Since Jackson did not receive a majority of the electoral votes, the election went to the House of Representatives, as the Constitution dictates, which voted by states. As Speaker of the House, Henry Clay occupied a unique position of power. Henry Clay despised Jackson as a, quote, military chieftain who was unfit for president. Although Clay was not personally close to Adams, the 2 men were both nationalists who supported the American system. Clay's influence won out and Adams won the presidency. Shortly after winning the presidency, Adams named Clay his Secretary of State. Jackson's outraged supporters promptly accused Adams and Clay of a corrupt bargain that had overridden the will of the people by cheating Jackson out of the presidency. Early big takeaway here, Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay did not get along. The election of 1828, John Quincy Adams versus Andrew Jackson. A true nationalist, Adams hoped to accomplish great projects. He championed an ambitious program of internal improvements and called upon Congress to establish a national university. However, Adams' presidency proved to be disappointing. Although he possessed a brilliant intellect, Adams lacked personal charm. His alleged political deal with Clay tarnished his presidency. Remember the corrupt bargain. Jackson's ardent supporters in Congress undermined the Adams presidency by voting down much of his proposals. They eagerly looked forward to the presidential election of 1828 when they fully expected the popular will to prevail. So let's talk about the election. The first party system provided political stability by allowing the peaceful transfer of power from one set of elite leaders to another. Because of property qualifications, very few white males and no women, blacks, or Native Americans actually voted. During the 1820s, state legislatures eliminated most property qualifications, enabling a growing number of white males to vote. Led by Martin Van Buren, Jackson's supporters shrewdly launched a new style of campaigning that included parades, mass rallies, leaflets, barbecues, and of course, a lot of shaking hands and kissing babies. More of a modern campaign was born. For the first time in American history, candidates were trying to appeal to everyone, not just the party elites. The 1828 presidential election featured a rematch between Jackson and John Quincy Adams. One passionate pro-Jackson newspaper editor captured the spirit of partisan politics by urging voters, To the polls, to the polls. Let no one stay home. Let not one vote be lost. So one of the earlier get out the vote drives. The appeal worked. Jackson swept the South and the West and easily crushed Adams in both the popular and electoral votes. His victory began a new era of American history. Now for some key aspects of Jacksonian democracy. To his vast group of admirers, Andrew Jackson provided an example of what an able and ambitious man born without privilege might become. So think American dream. Andrew Jackson redefined the American presidency. Before Jackson, most presidents yielded to Congress, and although they were supposed to be equal, Congress was basically the most powerful branch of government. Many of the actions of Jackson set into motion the President of the United States becoming more powerful. Belief in the common man. Jacksonians, or Jackson supporters, had great respect for common sense and the abilities of the common man. Admirers saw Jackson as a common man who represented the interests of the people. Now, although Jackson became very wealthy, he certainly was a self-made man. Expanded suffrage. Jacksonians enthusiastically supported the expansion of white male suffrage. This became known as universal white male suffrage. That meant that the property requirements for voting were removed. During the Federalist era, caucuses of party leaders selected candidates. During the Jackson administration, nominating conventions replaced legislative caucuses. The nominating process became more democratic. So as an example of expanded white male suffrage, in 1824, 350,000 people had voted. By 1840, 2.5 million people had voted in the presidential election. Now, patronage or the spoils system. The Jacksonians supported patronage, the policy of rewarding political supporters with government positions. Many Jacksonians believed the victorious candidate had a duty to reward their supporters and punish the opponents. This became known as the spoils system. The spoils system also led to the growth of power and expansion in general of political parties. A champion of the common man, Andrew Jackson despised special privileges of Eastern elites. And as we take a closer look at the Jackson presidency, you will see that him despising the elites becomes very evident. Now, the Tariffs of Abominations. There were a couple of key events in Jackson's presidency, and the Tariffs of Abomination certainly was one of them. Tariffs traditionally served the dual purpose of raising revenue and protecting American industry from European competitors. For example, the 1816 tariff averaged 25% of the value of imported goods. In 1828, Congress unexpectedly passed a protective tariff that pushed rates to over 50% of the value of imports. This was a big change. Led by South Carolina, the southern states branded the hated law Tariffs of Abomination. Southerners argued that while the industrial Northeast flourished, the South was forced to sell its cotton in an unprotected world market and buy imported goods at very high rates because of the tariffs. Vice President John C. Calhoun anonymously responded to the Tariffs of Abomination by writing the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. Calhoun drew upon states' rights arguments first formulated by Jefferson and Madison in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. Insisting that the Union was a compact of sovereign states, Calhoun argued that when a federal law exceeded the delegated power of Congress, a state or states can declare the law null and void within their borders, so they could nullify it. Inspired by Calhoun, the South Carolina legislature adopted an ordinance of nullification repudiating the Tariffs of Abominations. Jackson certainly did not like this. Jackson angrily denounced nullification as an impractical absurdity and warned South Carolina that the disunion by armed force is treason. He then demanded Congress pass a force bill authorizing him to use the Army to enforce federal laws in South Carolina. As tension mounted, Henry Clay proposed a new compromise tariff that would gradually reduce duties over the next 10 years. The compromise worked, and South Carolina rescinded its nullification ordinance. Another example of Henry Clay being able to create compromise. Calhoun did not advocate for secession or leaving the United States. Instead, he saw nullification as a viable option that would prevent disunion. Jackson may have sensed that he had not gone far enough in suppressing nullification. On his deathbed in 1845, he bitterly regretted that he did not execute Calhoun for treason. He said, quote, "My country would have sustained me in the act, and his fate would have been a warning to traitors in all time to come." Andrew Jackson had what was known as a kitchen cabinet. Now, he had his official presidential cabinet, but this kitchen cabinet was an unofficial group of advisors that Jackson would meet with regularly in the White House kitchen. And they were seen as being given backdoor privileges to the White House. This is a famous political cartoon about a kitchen cabinet meeting. You can see it takes place in a kitchen with utensils and a table there. And often these kitchen cabinet meetings got very heated. So for some big takeaways, Andrew Jackson certainly changed American politics. During his time, the American political system became more democratic. He certainly changed the presidency and the scope of power of the presidency, and he pushed the limits of presidential power further than any of his predecessors. Andrew Jackson is a very controversial historical figure, to say the least. We will talk more about this, but his treatment of Native Americans, treatment of African Americans, many of his policies have had many historians rethink his legacy. Much like Thomas Jefferson, though, Andrew Jackson was a conflicted person. For instance, while he was very harsh towards Native Americans, he ended up adopting 2 Native American children. So again, this is part 1, and I hope this helps you better understand Andrew Jackson.